Hi, everybody. Boy, I hated to disrupt that beautiful Chopin. Thank you for making that the opening music this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. We appreciate you've come to join us for City Talk. These are our regular conversations where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next for Canada's cities. Very, very pleased to have quite a large constituency, obviously very interested in the topic of housing, which appears to be one of the most talked about topics in civic discourse in this country, and not just here. But if you're paying attention, you're hearing about the housing collapse in China, you're hearing about what's going on in the United States. And these are all very important topics for us to be exploring together. And so I'm very appreciative that our colleagues have joined us, who have just bravely released a report that on the calling for a new housing accord. But before I introduce them, just to remind everybody that we've had quite an interesting summer across the country. I want to call it the summer of our discontent. It feels like we've had all sorts of weather disturbances. We've had different kinds of incidences intensified by heat and by inflation and various economic pressures. And so we want to just acknowledge that there are people across the country that are coming to terms with a lot of struggle and difficulty. We particularly think of the communities in the West, in British Columbia, and our colleague Rebecca Alty, who's been doing a Herculean effort to try to move people out of Yellowknife and now back into Yellowknife. So what a summer it has been on the East, in Quebec, in Northern Ontario, in Northern Alberta, in the territories, and in British Columbia. So I hope we continue to learn. City building is not for the faint of heart, and we continue to come to terms with various challenges. We're also, as all of us do, remind ourselves that we are on a number of ancestral territories from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I encourage you to put into the chat where you're coming in from and which ancestral territory you're part of. I, this summer, have had an opportunity to get to know in a little bit more detail Six Nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who we've had various discussions and meetings with on various topics, and just reminding ourselves of the fundamental attachment that we have to land that actually was not ours and continues to not be, in many cases, not covered by a treaty or covered by a contested treaty. And what does reconciliation really need to look like for all of us engaged in an ongoing learning process around cities and city building and communities? So I want to acknowledge that off the top. The other thing I'd like to do is just indulge me for a second. Could you put into the chat, if you are participating today from your home or from your office? And I know a lot of you will say your home is your office, but you know what I mean. So are you coming in? I am in my office here. Where are you? Just office, home. Just curious. I know we can run polls. I don't know how to do them on Zoom, and I didn't ask my staff to do that, but I'm just curious who's coming in from the office and who's coming in from home. And similarly, are you anticipating this fall? Are you going to wear a mask or no mask? So when you've got a minute, just punch those words in: home, office, mask, no mask. And this morning, we're going to chat about this unbelievably complex problem, challenge of housing. No easy answers. And I appreciate that these three organizations collaborated to produce a report, involved a bunch of consultants and advisors. And so we've asked one of them to join us today. And I'm going to encourage us to have a really constructive conversation in the chat, not only about this report and the points that it's making and the recommendations it's offering, but also the general topics. And so those of you who have tuned into City Talks over the last 3 years know that we have a very live, active chat community. If you've never signed up in a way that allows you to chat, I'd encourage you to enable your chat. You will learn a lot. You will see a lot of interesting comments from participants back and forth. It's a really great resource. And so we not only publish the recording, we also publish the chat so that everybody gets to benefit from what people raise. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't participated in the chat, today's the day, and you will benefit from seeing what your colleagues say there. And I'm going to encourage us to be constructive and respectful, obviously, because this is not an easy topic, has lots of different perspectives and angles and different realities in different parts of the country. So the richer we can be in sharing our perspective, our knowledge, our experience, and the things that we're challenged by, the more benefit we bring to the whole discourse. So I'm going to ask my colleagues, please, to turn their cameras on, because we have the authors of the the report here to talk to us about the Housing Accord, and their colleague, Carolyn Weitzman, who was one of the contributors. And thank you for joining us in City Talk, and thanks for producing this report so that we can get a chance to really have an active dialogue and an active discussion about it. And so first I'd like to go to Michael Brooks from the Real Property Association. We always put people's bios in the chat so that we don't spend much time here relaying them. Michael's in the UK today, and I appreciate him taking time out of his, I'm assuming it was a holiday, to tune in before you fly back to Canada. Michael, start us off. Just let me understand why RealPAC got engaged in this, what you were trying to accomplish, and just a few sort of introductory comments from you about your perspective, what you learned through the process. Over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mary. Everybody hopefully can hear me okay. And it's a pleasure to be on City Talk with you and with the large number of constituents on this. I think we're looking for a dialogue. It's my belief that outcome is always based on the quality of the process and the quality of the people in the process. We had an opportunity, and I will give Tim all the credit. I've known Tim for several years, but I'll give Tim the credit for reaching out and saying, Mike, look, we got to get together. We've got to talk, and we've got to come up with solutions that work for the entire spectrum of the housing supply, from market all the way down to homelessness. As you know, in Canada, the prevailing way that we all like to work through housing is we start off in apartments and we kind of go to a bigger apartment, and then maybe we go to a small home, and then we move forward. So we kind of go up the property ladder, if I can put it that way. But in this difficult time, we have many folks going down the property ladder. And Tim will know that a lot of folks end up homeless. I'm actually in London, UK on business, and been asking my colleagues from all around the world who are here with me, you know, what's it like in your country? What's it like in your country? And you could talk about England, Spain, France, Germany, Australia. Everybody's in the same boat talking about this issue. So that was the genesis of this. Try to get 12 to 14 reasonable, open-minded people in the same room, all of whom had understandings of the housing market, if not from their own perspective, from the broader perspective. And let's just spend a day with the doors locked and try to figure out what would a blueprint for housing reform in Canada look like. And I'm reminded now that I'm in England today anyway, by Bob Geldof, who you'll remember. And there was a sign that Geldof put at the door to that recording session. And that sign was, leave your egos at the door. And that was what everybody did in this session. It was remarkably constructive. So 4 or 5 folks from the not-for-profit side, 4 or 5 folks from the private sector side, and that was my job to bring those folks in. And all of those folks, including me, had experience in either community housing or government-owned social housing. So all of those folks had a sensitivity to the other side of the table. That, I think, together with the openness of those folks in the not-for-profit world, really was a breakthrough. And I will give one more piece of credit after crediting Tim, and that's to Dr. Moffat, because we hired him as a moderator, but he really was a peer to all of us and a partner in the whole process. And Mike has been fantastic in cooking the meal that is the Accord with 15 cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. I think we had, 10 drafts? So kudos to Mike for being able to bring us all together. And I've probably spoken for way too long.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Michael. We're gonna go you by Michael and Moffat by Mike. What's interesting to me is what you suggested about how do you actually get to a place where you can have that kind of even-handed exchange, right? Because I can see, just from our perspective, from CUI's perspective, watching the discourse play out, that there's a tendency, first of all, it gets political, and then it also gets people want to blame somebody, and they'll start to sort of personify, well, that sector are the bad guys, and you know what I mean? And I find that this is one of the great challenges to solving challenges in cities, is that we not demonize each other. But somehow you were able to create that safe space, eh?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that we all recognize that we have to focus on supply. We're undersupplied. This is maybe Dr. Moffat's forte, but during the process, the immigration numbers that we were dealing with kept on going up. Okay, so there's landed immigrants, but what about the students and temporary foreign workers? What? They're in the mix too? Okay. And I think that Dr. Moffat will correct me. I think that we're up to close to 2 million people came in 2022. I mean, it's unbelievable how StatsCan didn't arm us with this knowledge. So we're overwhelmed on the demand side, and we have to build supply. To be fair to those, and there'll be those, I'm sure, on the call who will criticize the private sector on the existing housing front, that's another issue to follow. It's on my agenda. But we were very focused on new supply of all types, not-for-profit, co-ops, everything. So we didn't need to pick a villain. We just needed to all focus on getting the job done.
I'm sure that there are people in the chat who are going to have their own views about the characterization of, do we need supply or don't we need supply? I think, and I'm anticipating people are already responding in the chat around that. I think the key thing is we need solutions, this we know. And, regular folk get frustrated when advocates or people in the industry who are seen to have a financial interest and financial benefit, we all get frustrated with people suggesting that it's this fault or that fault, when really we just want to get the darn thing solved. So I guess that's part of the recommendations in the Accord, is that there are a bunch of different measures to try to address a bunch of different challenges. I'm going to go next, if I could, to Tim Richter, who's an advocate and who's has been focused in his career on ending homelessness. That's how you and I first got to know each other when I was in New York. And then you then have taken on co-chairing the National Housing Council, so you've been close to the National Housing Strategy. So you are both advocate and policy advisor, and somehow had a phone call with Michael Brooks to say, we better find a way to find some common cause. So tell me your perspective in terms of how this report and this process got going, and how you've been able to feel that it represents the people that you advocate on behalf of, the organizations.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things just to build on what Michael says. I think, getting together with, basically like cats and dogs getting along, it's risky, right? It's risky for everyone who's kind of going into that room, right? We've had, as you alluded to, in the homelessness world, there are many bones we could have to pick with private landlords or others in the market. But the simple fact of the matter is, from my perspective, that homelessness is the product of high rental costs and low availability, right? It's not about mental illness. It's not about addiction. It's not about any of those things primarily. First and foremost, homelessness is a housing problem. The second thing, and this is kind of an awareness that I kind of always had in the back of my mind, but something that's become much more apparent to me anyway, is that housing is a system, and they're all interconnected, right? So I really need to focus on the non-market housing system, but the fact is, everybody in core housing need, and those are at risk of homelessness, are most likely living in market rental apartments somewhere. Right. And if the market part of the rental universe doesn't work, then the burden goes onto the non-market. If the market and the non-market don't work, or in the ownership market is somehow bunged up, right, that puts pressure on the rental market. So housing is the system, and I'm not going to solve homelessness just by focusing on non-market housing. I have to look at housing as a system and try and work with the folks in that system. And the last thing I'll say is, just look at the scale of the problem, right? Mike Moffat does a great job of outlining some of the barriers, right? The barriers to new housing development. So it's not just about money, and it's not just about supply. There's a lot of barriers there that are preventing this housing from being created. But just look at the scale. This problem began in the 80s. Canada, most of Canada's rental housing stock was built before 1980, right? The wheels came off of federal government investment in social housing in the 90s. This problem is 40 years in the making. It's going to cost well over $1 trillion to fix it. I guarantee you there's no government that's going to put $1 trillion into housing. Therefore, we necessarily have to engage the private market and private capital to begin to fix what is a system, right? So that we can focus public investment, in my view, focus public investment on the non-market components, right? So again, it's thinking about it as a system.
I wonder if the system framing allows us to drop some of our ideology around it, because I think that's the dilemma that I experience, is that some people are wedded to a particular set of values that they see manifesting in whatever the dysfunction is of housing choice, right? So if you're saying, wait a sec, it's a whole complex bunch of actors and systems and things that overlay. We all know that Canadian jurisdictional responsibilities are rather complex. Does that help so that you get the biggest picture you possibly can, and then see if you can focus on some key intervention points?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think you're looking for leverage points in the system to create a different outcome, right? So you need to create, you need to, get channel private capital to build a rental market that most people in low income households will live in, to provide them that security. So the leverage point are those 6 barriers and the investment, right? So you want to think about that. And then, anyway, I think that's a big part of it. But, right now, over 260,000 Canadians are going to experience homelessness this year. That is a wild underestimate, right? It's likely much, much higher than that. It erases half of a person's life expectancy. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have the luxury of ideology. I got a problem that I have to solve. Like, we have to fix this or people get hurt. So I will talk to who I need to talk to achieve that end. And, in working in homelessness, one of the things I've learned from frontline workers is, when you approach someone, who's experiencing homelessness, you have to suspend judgment, right? You have to take judgment out of the conversation, look at where we can come up with mutually agreeable outcomes, and then take steps toward recovery, right? It's step by step. I'm not going to get to, we're collectively not going to get to a perfect rental housing system in one jump, right? But we are going to make, and what this accord does, are steps in the right direction. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything. It's not intended to fix everything, but it's intended to create a roadmap.
Right, and maybe the roadmap, that notion that that you can have a journey that involves many paths, and that people that want to focus on a particular segment of the market can focus on that. I'm speaking market, small end market there, and others can focus on things. I hear you on this, though, that it's as if we reached a pitch of crisis that made people say, okay. Same with the pandemic. I always feel that during the pandemic we had to let a lot of this drop as well, and just get down to how do you get those portable washrooms in the parks, right? Exactly. Okay, thanks, Tim. I want to now go to Dr. Moffat, as he was being referred to, aka Mike, to talk specifically about this kind of a stew of collaboration that you tried to stitch together, Mike, and how that worked. And then I want you to speak a bit about the recommendations, and then I'm going to come to Carolyn, who was one of the advisors and who's been in this field for some time, to get a sense of her critique, and then I'll invite people from the chat to give us some questions and have some discussion back and forth. So over to you, Mike.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was an interesting process, to be sure, that we basically locked 15 people into a room or so and not let them out till they come up with some kind of agreement. And this, it was a diverse group. I have to admit, I was pretty nervous walking in there that I'd have to acts more, break up some fights and things like that. But I was actually surprised how quickly we came together as a group and found that common ground. And one of the things that we did is try to really focus on, like, what is the problem we're trying to solve. And we used a framework that came out of some other work that we had done with the Ontario Big City Mayors. Because if you think about it, in some sense, it is kind of strange that we're in this crisis, right? That we know, for instance, and we can, talk about how, we should talk about housing as a system and different types of housing. But I know out there that there are a lot of people who would like an energy efficient, affordable rental apartment in a walkable neighborhood. Why don't we have that? That if there was a huge market demand for pens, you'd see BIC making a whole lot more pens. So why is this not happening? And we basically looked at all of the bottlenecks to producing the type of housing that people want in the communities in which they want to live. And we came up with 6 core problems that we need to address. And the 6 are as follows. At first, is there's just a massive coordination problem in a variety of different housing areas. And we see this in a number of areas. Like, this has come up recently with international students. Whose job is it to house international students? Whose job is it to even forecast how many students we're going to have? It's not clear. And we make all of these sort of policy decisions in silos, both between governments, but also within governments. So this is a big coordination problem. The second is ability. There might be stuff that we want to build, but we just can't because we run into some physical bottleneck. Labor shortages are the obvious one, but we saw this during the pandemic, supply chain issues, things like that. There can be issues around availability of land, raw materials, and so on. So that's the second bottleneck. The third is what I call viability. Some of this stuff we just can't, under the current set of policies and the current sort of economic conditions, they're just not economically viable. And that could be for-profit groups or not-for-profit groups, where you could have a not-for-profit group who wants to put up a 6-story mass timber affordable apartment unit, but they can't make the numbers work even if we take profit out of the equation. The fourth is productivity. My dad was a sheet metal worker, did heating and cooling, like HVAC work in apartments in the 60s and 70s. If I put him on a job site today, his job wouldn't have changed much in 60 years, despite the fact that we don't really build anything else the same way 60 years ago. So that makes it hard to scale up, right? That is a very, it's a sector where we haven't seen a lot of productivity increases. The next is permissions, that there's some stuff that we can't, we'd like to be able to do, but we can't. And that's, everything from the building code to zoning rules to, CMHC and so on. And then finally, big elephant in the room is obviously a lack of non-market housing. That, as Tim's pointed out, that over the last 40 years, government has gotten out of the business of a variety of housing forms, including things like on-campus student rentals. So any solution set, in our view, any purpose-built rental supply-side solution has to address those 6 bottlenecks. So that's what we did as far as the recommendations go. And you can go through the 10 recommendations, and each one of them specifically goes after those 6, or at least the first 8 go after those 6, with 2 additions that we also recognize that we're not going to be able to build those overnight. So recommendations 9 and 10 talk about how we can come up with funding programs to keep existing people in their homes and not have them fall into homelessness. Oh, and the last problem, we just call it a lack of non-market housing. It was a shame that all the 5 we could come up with nice one word terms for it, and 6 was kind of hand wavy because there's no great single term for it.
not as concise.
Not as concise.
Thanks, Mike. Interesting as you suggest that there's not one solution and it's got to be a mix of things. And I'm interested to hear from Carolyn now, who was, I gather, a participant in the process and who's got has focused her particular recent research on a particular component of this. And then I'm going to ask all of you to put your cameras on once Carolyn finishes, and then we'll have a broader conversation. Lots of folks, as I predicted, lots of engagement in the chat. You're missing things if you're not reading the chat. You're all multitaskers. You can listen and you can read the chat at the same time. Carolyn, over to you, your perspective on this process and what do you think is new? Because you and I are, I'm a little older than you, but we've been around a while. Like, what is new in this Housing Accord document and the process that they used to arrive at it?
Oh, what's new? Well, first of all, I was one of the 15 people locked in a room. To be fair, the food was excellent, so that helped. Look, I want to go back to something Tim said and just sort of recast it a little bit. I'm actually an intensely political person because I think that the current housing crisis we're in is caused by political choices. The political choices around non-market housing happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Some of the decisions that are talked about in the Accord were made in 1972, for instance, around purpose-built rental taxation settings and negative gearing and a whole bunch of things. So we're talking about a deficit that's been going on for 30 to 50 years. In Canada, a democracy, we're not going to be expecting to see a federal party in power for 30 to 50 years, as much as every party wants to be that one. At all three levels of government, and we do, I mean, this is the housing crisis is because of a failure at all three levels of government. It's very rare for all three levels of government to be the same, municipal, provincial, federal, and in fact, it never happens across Canada. So what we do need is a broad tent approach that's based on some simple principles. Fortunately, we have those simple principles. We have the right to housing enshrined in law as of 2019. We have definitions of affordability that are the ones used internationally. For instance, 30% of household income. That's a measure that's used internationally. The problem is we talk about it in our definitions, we measure it, we have targets based on it, we don't have programs based on it. We have a whole bunch of tools that we know have worked in the past. Acquisitions of private apartments for non-market housing, that's worked in the past and it's mentioned in the Accord. Scaling up non-market housing has worked in the past to create affordable housing for low and moderate income people. In the early 1970s, when we were building 260,000 homes a year, and at least 50,000 homes a year were purpose-built rental, we had affordable rental for low-income households and certainly for moderate-income households. And we had moderate-income affordability, like you didn't need to even be middle class to buy a starter home. Now we have home costs that are 3 times what they were in the 1980s, 4 times what they were in the 1980s in Toronto, 5 times what they were in the 1980s in Vancouver. So we need to sort of go, okay, we've got some problems. Let's start counting accurately. Let's talk about income categories, which, as you know, Mary, is a particular interest of mine with the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project. I mean, basically, by our calculations, we have about 500,000 one-person households that can afford to pay $420 a month for housing. How are we going to create 500,000 homes, acquire whatever, 500,000 homes at $420 a month? And maybe we also need to look at guaranteed annual income, which I can get into, but it's a bit off topic. We need about 3 million homes for people who are counted in the census, but also people who literally aren't counted in our calculation of housing needs. Students aren't counted as part of core housing need. Homeless people aren't counted. 700,000 people in congregate housing, whether it's long-term care or group homes, aren't counted in core housing need. Migrant workers aren't counted in core housing need. People who are driving 100 kilometers to their workplace aren't counted in core housing need. Households that would want to be formed, whether it's adults moving away from their parents or people in violent relationships moving away, that's not counted in core housing need. So we need a universal language that can be used, that can be led by the federal government, picked up by provinces and municipalities, associated with targets. And that's what has worked in Canada in the past, and it's what's worked in other countries in the past to actually make a real difference. So for me, the Accord is the start of that consensus-based process that can have political viability in the way that any infrastructure plan, you don't talk about 2 years or 4 years, like the Housing Accelerator Fund, you start talking about 30 years and 50 years, and there's a common language to talk about these issues.
Thank you. I've had a hell of a time trying to keep up with the chat myself. There you go. Might be the first time on City Talk that I would actually admit that. So thank you for all the vibrancy on City Talk, plus what the participants are offering. So if we could see them all at once, that would be great. One of the common threads that I think we're pulling up here is, well, obviously that it's a system, that we need many options and many different kinds of actions to be taken. I want to talk about the fancy word for it is agency, but I'm interested in hearing from the four of you in terms of you having immersed yourselves in this for the last couple of months to get the Accord, and then all your ongoing work that you've been doing on this topic for so long. How do we make this topic small enough that everyone feels they have a way to contribute to the solution? Because what I am fearful of is that if we sit back too far and spend a lot of time talking about large system change, people start to get dispirited because they don't actually know how they themselves or their business or their organization or their kids can actually engage in solution making. So how do we get this to be small enough that it's actionable at the local level? I can see folks in the chat from different sized communities that are trying to take matters in their own hands and find local solutions. And I'm wondering what kind of encouragement you four can offer to them about that. Who wants to go first? I'll just call on you. Mike.
I'll start, but it's
you
just
start, Carolyn.
I mean, in almost every community, there's some group that you can join to act collectively. I mean, part of the problem is, or I should say part of the good news is that housing used to be a them issue. It's like, oh yeah, poor unfortunates, but we're okay. It's a little bit like looking out the window this summer and saying, hey, there's no wildfires in my vicinity, I'm doing fine. But we're starting to see wisps of smoke everywhere across Canada, to use that metaphor. So the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness has a number of local alliances to end homelessness. If you're concerned, and as you say, I'm almost like everything's flashing before my eyes, but I see a lot of people concerned about tenants' rights. I was part of the Parkdale Tenants Association in Toronto back in the day that I was a renter. There are a lot of tenant associations, and there's a lot of groups that are working on tenants' rights. There are also, and this is fairly recent and fairly new, I think you were asking about that, Mary, a lot of YIMBYs, and a lot of YIMBYs across the political spectrum. I've been a YIMBY my whole life. I've been looking at why it seems much easier for governments to say no to low-cost housing solutions and to say yes. And it encourages me to no end to see particularly people under 40 who are locked out of affordable housing options joining YIMBY groups across Canada. So whatever your starting point, there is a local group and probably a national group that you can join to advocate for better housing policies.
And we've watched during COVID the consultation mechanisms that were available for governments that had to do public consultation on particular development projects, because they went online, meant that you had a whole bunch of stakeholders coming into those public meetings who don't necessarily live in that neighborhood, but would say, I'd like to live in that neighborhood, thanks. So I wonder if that gave a bit of a boost to the YIMBY sentiment. More Neighbors Toronto was one example. There's also a similar organization in Calgary that are marshalling people to say yes to development. And I see Gil Penalosa saying, let's have a renovation revolution. Absolutely. So all of these things in smaller increments. I'm wondering, when you look at the industry, Michael, and you look at how your sector is perceived, you're generally, I think, perceived, I mean, listen, it's a big, complicated sector, but that you guys only want to build big, and you only want to build multi, and you only want to build high end and make big profits. How do you counter that in terms of what we know as a more diverse sector that is engaged in creating housing units? How do you move more energy into those smaller projects that aren't necessarily as ambitious and maybe not as lucrative as the bigger ones?
It's a very good question. I can tell you that our sector is evolving. There's probably 10 impact funds that I'm aware of, privately owned, in our sector, and that number is growing. I can tell you that the pension funds are increasingly looking at affordable housing as an asset class, like it is in the US and like it is in Europe. We need some mechanisms to, I think, get across the goal line, and they were mentioned in the accord. So, like the whole housing system is a system, so is the private market, and I have to look at barriers for the investor, barriers for the lender, barriers for the builder. I have to look at all three of those, and then the approval barrier, and figure out what's the problem. You know, because all of you on this call will have seen headlines that for many projects coast to coast, they don't pencil out anymore.
Right.
Pens are down. There's so much uncertainty about, is there going to be an interest rate hike in 2 weeks or a week from now? When are they going to start coming down? Are they going to start coming down at all? How do I make my pro forma work? What rent can I charge when this thing finally gets built? What will be the taxes that I pay all the way through? Each pro forma is going to be different. And I can tell you that I've heard that even the not-for-profit sector, deals may not pencil out anymore. So construction costs are high. Interest rates are 2.5 times what they were 2 years ago. So there's a lot of barriers on our side, and we have to pick through each one and solve all of those barriers to solve the whole system on the private side.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in, Mary, just to furiously agree with Michael that whether you're particularly for nonprofit, the settings aren't there to build homes, not just studios, but 2-3 bedrooms that are $1,000 a month, which is what's affordable to low-income households across Canada, or even $2,500 a month, which is what's affordable to households earning above average incomes across most of Canada. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of zoning, in terms of building code. California just passed some changes to the building code that will enable point access blocks that allow small apartment buildings with larger units, more energy efficient, better sunlight, et cetera, et cetera. All of those options are out there. They're working in Europe that have completely different kinds of building codes. But we really have to start from the point, how are we going to start scaling up not just housing, not just rental housing, but rental housing that's $1,000 or $2,000 a month. And these solutions are out there once we make that the problem. And those solutions are non-market, but they also can be and have been in the past private market.
Always interesting to hear folks like you talking so constructively about that we're in the problem-solving business. Cities are about solving problems. That's what cities do. I'll just hearken people to go back and read The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the last chapter, the kind of problem a city is. And it's about work. Cities solving problems is about work. And I saw Charles Albert Ramsey this morning in Municipal World has put a really interesting article about cities being the producers of solutions. So a shout out to Municipal World and to Charles in Quebec about raising that issue, that's what we need to be focused on, to not be deterred from work. We all are about work, and that's what cities are about for these solutions. Interesting in terms of this notion of rules. Do rules need to change to enable the kind of individual action or collective action, Carolyn, you're saying people could join and be part of? And Michael, the issue you're raising with the industry, that there are various constraints and rules and monetary policy that are affecting pro formas. Tim, do you want to comment a bit about how people find their place in this? And then Mike Moffat, I'm going to come to you next.
I think it's that and the idea of rules, right? Like I've often joked, and I said this to our crew offline, is like homelessness and housing are the political equivalent of a junior high school dance, right? Like all different levels of government stood around the wall, staring at their feet, waiting for someone else to go first. And in the absence of any direction, this is everybody's problem, but nobody's. Right. And until we start the dance, until we get some coordination, right? Until we begin to have an agreement between levels of government, it's very difficult for people to find their place in that conversation, right? Until we settled that down. Imagine responding to the wildfires without a crisis plan, without municipal disaster response. Ending homelessness at a community level, you use the emergency response methodology effectively. It's very similar how you organize a local response to municipal disaster response. It's very, very similar. And where homelessness falls apart, it's not focused on housing, it's focused on shelter. But obviously municipal disaster response is focused on housing. But the difference is in a municipal disaster, in the wildfires, there's an agreement between municipal government, provincial government, federal government on their roles in that situation. In housing, there is no agreement. So the rules are confusing and at cross purposes. The roles are unclear. Nobody can find their place in it, and it's left up to local innovators to work around whatever system is there. That's why what I hope comes out of this process is some form of national housing accord, is some form of agreement between the three levels of government, agreement on the outcome, agreement on some of the definitions, as Carolyn is talking about, agreement on roles and agreement on outcomes. And then they can, like what our paper puts together is a bit of a roadmap on what should be included, but it's really kind of a skeleton in the beginning of what should be that negotiation.
It's interesting whether this is like a Trojan horse for rethinking federalism. Because housing has now been accepted as the current challenge, even though there are lots of others, homelessness and mental health and all the other things that are connected to it, or transit or economic development. Could this model of a multi-ordered, multi-sectoral approach be the Trojan horse for a new form of urbanism? Mike, is that too optimistic a picture that I might be drawing there? Because we're getting lots
I would actually reframe that. I think we
Okay.
need an old level of federalism. I think we need to do back what we did in the late 40s and early 1970s. Like if you look at the late 40s, like the CMHC practically built the town of Ajax, the federal government, right? And that's actually one of the things that we really tried to focus on in this accord is this is not the first time that Canada has had a housing crisis. I would argue there's been at least two. The first, or at least two since World War II. The first was immediately after World War II, when we had all the returning veterans coming home from Europe, and we hadn't built any houses, and even before the war because of the Depression, massive housing shortage. So what did we do back then? We had a very aggressive CMHC that did things like have a catalog of pre-approved housing designs that allowed for approvals to be done quickly, allowed for economies of scale, and allowed for productivity. So part of what we're doing is suggesting, hey, let's bring that back, but let's have a 2023 version where, we're not just building wartime bungalows, and we might want some of those as well, but what about having a pre-approved design for a 6-story missing middle mass timber home that, you know, is incredibly energy efficient, could even be net zero. Then we could start building those at scale, which leads to better housing and climate outcomes.
So Mike, can I just, I mean, the Sears homes, right? I've just
Yep.
spent 3 days in Eastern Ontario near Petawawa, where the Air Force Base is, and I could see the kind of manufacturing housing that you're talking about that we have done at various points and in various places. Are you saying, for instance, a shout out then to manufactured housing, that we should see more willingness to go down that path?
Yes.
Even though people will be worried that it's a bit on the ugly side. Just saying.
Well, I don't think tent cities look that attractive either. I think you know, it's pick your poison here. I think it can be made, but you know, there's stuff in between, right? There's panelization, there's things like that we can use innovation policy for. We have to look at the building code that oftentimes we can't use these things because of the building code. The building code is actually preventing us from the innovations. And again, the second kind of housing crisis I would look at is the late 1960s, early 1970s, when we had two things happening at the same time. That, first of all, we liberalized immigration rules, which was an excellent thing, opened that up. And as well, we had the first wave of baby boomers going into their first apartment, going into college and university. So the federal government had a number of policies back then, partly to build social housing, but also to accelerate the market, like having policies like the accelerated capital cost allowance that Carolyn mentioned that's got blown up in 1972. So I actually think we need the old federalism back. That what happened was in the 80s and 90s, we eroded that the federal government basically said, oh, that's somebody else's problem. And in part, they did it to the point which that was actually in the Charlottetown Accord, that it was going to write out that, you know, housing is a provincial responsibility. I will point out to everyone, the Charlottetown Accord failed. Right? It is not the law of the land, but for some reason, we're all sort of acting like these constitutional Meech Lake Charlottetown Accord of the 80s and 90s somehow got into practice. So I think all we need to do is not have a new federalism. I think we need to have a return to the old federalism, which is still on the books, and we've just forgotten about for whatever reason.
I can tell you the notions of old and new federalism have the chat blowing up, as does my little cavalier comment that maybe manufacturing housing is ugly. All right, I hear you. It can be beautiful. It can be attractive. Let's go to the question of money, access to capital, because Michael laid that out, and we can all see it in our communities now, that there seem to be projects where there was something happening and now there's nothing happening. And everybody has their own version of this, of their own anxiety and their own experience of it. You mentioned, Michael, about a number of funds, social finance funds, that are forming up. We're seeing lots of corporate interest through ESG. I just want to let everybody know that can't see the chat that a lot of these people in these senior roles are on this session. I can see them. And so let's talk about whether we need to find more financial vehicles to de-risk building across the housing continuum. Would that help, Michael? Would we see more entrance into the industry, building smaller projects if they could get cheaper cash?
Yes, absolutely. And that's both cheaper on the equity side, that's your investor, and cheaper on the debt side. That is interest rates, but maybe that's Canada Infrastructure Bank, or the federal government. So on the investor side, will they take a lower return to be in the affordable housing sector? Yes. Yes, they will. As long as it's long duration and it is stable. Then go to the debt side. 5-year money won't cut it. We want long-term money like in the US. We want 25-year money. We want 30-year money. This is Mike's idea. Why can we not get 25-year mortgages at today's bond rate, 3.94, 4%? Why can we not get just match funds that for 20? That would push a lot of projects over the goal line. Can we get rid of some silly tax? Can we get rid of HST on purpose-built rental? It just goes into a black hole federally. Why are you charging that tax? It doesn't add any value.
Michael, do you think that would have a measurable impact if you got rid of the HST? I think there are some that feel that's tinkering at the edges. Do you think it would make a difference?
Yes, I do. Would it get how many projects would it get built tomorrow morning? I don't know. I just know when you have a lower tax environment, all of a sudden there's green shoots, and some deals that were offside become onside again. The total taxes, fees, and charges, you've probably seen this data, north of 30% Canada-wide.
Right.
To build an $800,000 condo, taxes, fees, and charges are going to be 30% of that, over $200,000. Is all that necessary? Well, you have to have a dialogue with the municipalities. Do you need all that money? Can we get by with 150? Do you really need basements in every hill? Do you need 66-foot right-of-ways for every? Do you need sidewalks on both sides? Do you need all of these things? Can you not cut back a little bit and make these things affordable?
So what
And
you're
just
identifying.
to jump in, Mary, I
Go
mean,
ahead,
one of
Carolyn.
the advantages of long-term guaranteed rate mortgages, other than introducing certainty, and every developer, whether they be a non-market developer or market developer, needs certainty, is that you could attach conditionality to it. The assisted rental program in the 1970s pegged low and moderate income rents to the financial package being offered to non-market and market developers. I also, I'm going to be a big fan, as you may or may not know, of modular. The fact is that Sweden built 1 million homes in Canadian terms. 1 million homes in Sweden in the 1960s is 6 million homes today in Canada. On the back of modular, and that not only was successful in building 1 million no-cost homes, it also led to the success of IKEA, because once you have these standardized rooms, you can have standardized bookcases in them. So I've seen modular companies come from nearly zero to exporting to the US in the last few years because of the Rapid Housing Initiative. So this isn't just about Canada being at huge economic risk because we have the highest level of personal debt in the world, and one of the lowest levels, by the way, of government social expenditure in the world among rich countries. It's about the economic future.
I have a question about rules. We're in the home stretch here. In terms of the federal agencies and departments that actually have carriage over this, is CMHC equipped with what it needs to have in terms of authorities and resources? Does it have what it needs to be able to provide the kinds of enabling conditions that I'm hearing you folks say that we want builders to take advantage of? That would be the first question. And then I guess a related, probably specifically to you, Tim, and others, would be, does the National Housing Strategy now need to be updated in a certain kind of way? So specifically CMHC thought, and just so you know, they're on the call listening, I see them. Thoughts on CMHC? Mike, first.
Oh, actually, Tim, do you want to take that one? I saw your hand up.
Well,
Go for it.
this is a conversation I've had with Romy directly, so I don't mind. I don't mind saying that. But I think structurally, so Canada got out of affordable housing investor, really that active role in housing 30, 40 years ago, and has effectively forgotten how to do it, right? And CMHC, they're full of really, really great people, but it's effectively a mortgage insurance company, right? And it's hard. You're trying to shift gears, and the government, where I think a mistake it made in the National Housing Strategy is it created this National Housing Strategy and then asked its mortgage insurance company to lead on policy. That they don't have the policy heft that they need to have, and in many ways, CMHC is trying to implement the National Housing Strategy with an arm tied behind its back because it doesn't have any say on fiscal policy, right? It doesn't have finance. Some of the biggest levers that the federal government has in hand is in finance, not in CMHC. So I think in some ways they were kind of handicapped. And the other thing is they developed the National Housing Strategy, they being the federal government, and then changed the markers along the way, right? So introduce the idea of a national housing, introduce RCFI, then introduce the idea of a national housing strategy, which, by the way, is a direct result of advocacy from people like Kathy Crow, who I know is on the line. Then they introduced the national housing, then they introduced the budget and the programs for the National Housing Strategy. Then they introduced the National Housing Strategy Act, which changed what the outcomes of the Housing Act should be, Then they introduced a commitment to ending chronic homelessness, which was in a speech from the throne. So the milestones, what it's supposed to do, are different than what it is set up to do. And the world changed in 7 years, right? So I think we need to give CMHC a little bit of grace to say they were kind of set up, right? And there's issues with some of the programs, but again, I think, yes, it's time for a rethink of the national housing strategy. And I think that's going to come very, very quickly.
I think the point, and sometimes the CUI sits in the middle of this with our with academics and with various folks, many of whom are on this chat. I can see them around providing best policy advice to CMHC and now to Infrastructure Canada, and as you suggested, access to the Ministry of Finance. And there are a number of people in the chat commenting on that. Part of the dilemma we have is that municipal services are funded through the property tax. So that creates a whole different dynamic. And how do we level that? So any other comments in terms of federal leadership? Go ahead, Mike Moffat.
Yeah, so it's going to add to that. And, this is something, I've been talking about for a while, that if we look at what needs to happen, or even the points in the accord, it actually stretches over about 8 or 9 different ministries, right? Because we also talk about productivity policy. That's innovation. But a lot of the modular housing startups and companies are in like rural Newfoundland or places like that. So that's regional economic development.
Right.
One of the biggest levers that the federal government has to drive innovation in housing is procurement. Well, that's Treasury Board, but also you look at who's going to buy the homes. One of the big areas that we should be looking at, and I say this personally because I've got a cousin-in-law. I've got a cousin-in-law in the Canadian Forces who has trouble finding homes for his family, right? So we should have the Department of Defense, buying some of these modular homes and in other areas. So, now we've got that department. So when we look at all of the departments who should be involved in this, you're probably getting into the double digits at some point. And that's why this coordination is so important, because the CMHC can't do it on its own, or even now that housing is under infrastructure, they only have a certain set of policy levers. They have to work, this has to be an all of government approach, which requires essentially leadership from the center.
There you go. All of government approach. One last thing I want to just chat. We've only got 3 more minutes, but land. Is cheaper or public land made available? Is land an important answer? Would you start with that, Carolyn?
Well, the HEART project has mapped out land at all 3 levels of government in 12 cities across Canada, and not just in obvious places like Ottawa and Gatineau, but also in Calgary and Edmonton. There is plenty of government land that's well suited for non-market mixed use, mixed income development, and that's definitely one of the places that I'd start. I'm meeting with the board of the Canada Lands Company tomorrow to talk to them. It's obviously something that is one of the many keys to the issue.
Mm-hmm. And who are the other land stewards that might be sitting on land that could be redeveloped or made available? That's another question, because it's orders of government, it might be school boards, it could be hospitals, it could be universities, right, Mike?
It can be transit lines, and Ontario
transit.
has been particularly useless when it comes to using train stations for affordable housing. I hear Mike laughing, something we're definitely in agreement about.
Someone is just, Kira Gerwig's just put in, what about churches? So listen, guys, as always is the case with City Talk, it's always the beginning of the conversation, not the end. And this chat will go down in history as one of the most lively chats we've ever had, both on screen and also on the chat column. And just to reassure people that haven't been able to keep up, we published the chat, so you'll get a chance to read it. I also just want to thank people who bothered to tell us whether they're coming in from home or work, and if they're going to mask or no mask. We'll tally that, send it out so people can see it. Not that it's an official poll or anything, but it is interesting to get a bead on how people are approaching things. Last sentence to each of you, the seminal thing you want people to take from your report. Tim Richter.
Homelessness and the housing crisis are solvable problems.
Are solvable?
Solvable problems.
Solvable problems. Thanks. Michael Brooks.
I would say that if I can help solve the homelessness and affordable housing problem, then the market housing problem will be solved itself.
Thanks, Michael. Carolyn?
Really, what Tim and Michael have said, I see, as Tim does, homelessness is part of the housing crisis. It is solvable. The solutions are out there. Let's do it.
It's solvable. Mike Moffat.
Okay, the last one is don't let people on Twitter play armchair constitutional lawyer. The federal government has a very important role in housing, despite what the Beach Lake Accord or Charlottetown Accord would make you believe. They never passed. So don't let the federal government off the hook. They have a role in policy, but also they need to wear the Team Canada jersey and coordinate all three orders of government.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Carolyn. Don't be a bystander. I feel like City Talk infuses in all of us a reminder that we are all engaged in this great pursuit and experiment of making cities better for everyone. A couple of plugs I'll put in. One is we'll post all this in a couple of days. You'll be able to see it. We'll also create a podcast from it so you can go on your walks and listen. Next week or 2 weeks from now, we're at the Art of City building in Halifax. We'll be doing a City Talk from there on the role of libraries and civic institutions in terms of boosting all the challenges that we're facing in urban life. We think libraries are critical to that. The week following, we are happy to support ICLEI in their Livable Cities Forum in downtown Mississauga. We hope a lot of you will tune into that. And also today, although you get an advanced preview, we're announcing tomorrow, we are opening registration for our first annual State of Canada Cities. We're publishing a report of which these folks are contributing, and we'll have a live session in Ottawa, nation's capital, on November 30. Registration opens for you guys today. You'll see it in a newsletter tomorrow. Plan to be with us to talk about at the crossroads and where cities are going. Thanks, November 30. Thanks, everybody. Really great that we got you on. Michael, travel safely back. And the conversation ain't over. It just begins. Thanks, everybody.